so much for joining us. My name is Ceri Thomas. I'm one of the editors and partners here at Tortoise. Thanks for joining us for tonight's looking back and trying to work out what does the budget mean is the question we've set ourselves. So it's about 30 hours since Sunak sat down after delivering that speech. And I've got a feeling that it's a budget we're going to be talking about for quite a long time. Now, that could be because it comes to be seen as a political watershed, the moment when the Conservative Party made a break with the years of austerity and decided to tax more and spend more to support public services. That's possible. Or it might be because we look back and think that the Chancellor made a massive mistake in underestimating inflation and the cost of living squeeze, or that he didn't do enough to address growth and productivity. Or I guess it could be that we think, again, in retrospect, that he didn't do enough to deal with what I think may be one of the real scarring effects of lockdown, which is the effect on children's education. Or 100 other things, of course, R&D, skills, the green agenda, plenty of dogs that barked quietly or loudly. But either way, I think there are big budgets and there are little ones, and this does feel like a big one in the scheme of things. So we've got a lot of ground to cover in the next hour, and a great set of people to help us cover it. Plus you, of course, because there's an awful lot of knowledge on this call, and I'm very, very keen to hear what you think. I want to know how you read the budget, how you see the politics of it, and whatever else is on your mind. So please do join in. Put your digital hand up and we'll pull you into the conversation, or start engaging with the chat. And one of my colleagues, I think it's James Wilson on chat tonight, will look out for you there and may pull you into the main conversation if we're fascinated by what you're saying in the chat. The people we've invited, especially this evening, we've got Dr. Gemma Tetlow, who's the Chief Economist at the Institute for Government. There's Gemma. We've got Richard Bergen, who's the East Leeds MP, Labour, of course. We've got Anne Longfield, who's the former Children's Commissioner. Mike Brewer from the Resolution Foundation, and we've got Gavin Rice from the Centre for Social Justice. Thank you all. I'll come to you all as quickly as I possibly can. But let me start with Gemma, if I may. Gemma from the Institute for Government. Can I begin with inflation? Because it's something that we've, I think, got increasingly aware of as forecasts have started to shift over the last 6 or 9 months. The Chancellor quoted the Office for Budget Responsibility central assumption that inflation is going to be around 4% or higher for the next 12 months or so. But how big is the sort of zone of uncertainty around inflation at the moment?
There is uncertainty about inflation, and really the uncertainty is this purely a temporary blip? Is this just, as really the OBR forecasts assume, about temporary factors as the global economy reopens after the pandemic, gosh. So is it really just about the fact that supply chains are currently still a bit disruptive, things aren't where they ought to be, and that's pushing up prices? And we've got temporary high energy prices as well because of shortages of supply. Is that going to be a temporary thing that the Bank of England and other central banks around the world can look through in the jargon, so they don't need to put up interest rates to tackle it? They can just rely on inflation coming back down. Or is it something that's going to become much more sort of permanently baked in? And one of the reasons to worry that it might become more permanent would be if it starts to get built into people's wage settlements, and you get that unhelpful wage price spiral of wages going up and then companies having to put up prices in response. And that was really what happened in the 1970s. So that's when people are worrying about going back to the 1970s, that's sort of what they're really worrying about.
And in your judgment, if it does remain 4% or above for a year, does that seem like a long enough period for you for those kind of expectations to start to get baked in? So as a worker, I think, okay, I can see prices rising. I'm going to factor that into my next wage demand, and off to the races you go. It looks to me, I'm not an economist, but it does seem to me that a year might be enough to start embedding that.
It is quite a good long time, and it could start to shift expectations. I think two things would sort of push against that compared to a few decades ago, perhaps. One is that we have a much less organised labour these days. There's much more sort of organised wage setting. So it's harder for that to get baked in. We can individually ask our employers, but we may not have that same power as you do with organised labour. And secondly, we've now had over 2 decades of central bank independence in the UK. And there is, I think, trust that the Bank of England's mission is to keep inflation down and that it will act to counter higher inflation, which wasn't the case back when we had chancellors setting interest rates, and it was a much more politically driven process. So I think for those 2 reasons, that probably less concern now than there might once have been that it will become baked in.
Okay. Obviously, the follow-on from inflation could be on interest rates, and some people saw the sort of the way the Chancellor referred to the Bank of England, sort of gave a nod to the Bank of England early in his budget statement yesterday as a sort of green light to go ahead and raise rates if that's what you want to do. But I was looking this morning at some OBR calculations. The OBRs, I think the sort of central assumption of economists is that there'll be a number of small interest rate rises over the next period. But the OBR put out these figures that, raise other possibilities of a much larger increases in interest rates if inflation does get embedded in the way you were talking about. How seriously do we have to take the prospect of interest rates at 3% or above, which was what the OBR was not predicting, but warning of as a sort of side bet?
So it is possible. I think it's worth being aware that there are 2 reasons you could end up with interest rates at 3%. If we end up there because the UK economy is growing strongly, and we're simply getting back to more normal times, and we don't any longer need the really loose monetary policy that we've had for the last decade or so, that could actually be good news for the economy. It's good news for tax revenues and for the Chancellor. And whilst it would come along with slightly higher borrowing costs for all of us and slightly higher debt interest costs for the government, it would overall be a positive story for public finances. It would be a worse world if we simply had a lot of import-driven price inflation, and that was why the Bank of England was having to stamp down on inflation whilst real growth wasn't really picking up. And
do you take the idea of interest rates at 3% seriously, or does that seem like a real outlier to you?
I think that would be an outlier in sort of thinking about the next 12 months or so. I think the sort of market average expectation is for something like 3 rate rises over the next year and a bit. 3% in historic context would be still not particularly outrageous. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the sort of 5% of the pre-financial crisis era. So it's the last decade or so that's been particularly unusual for interest rates, rather than that ultimately getting to 3% would be a crazy situation.
Yeah, no, it's a way of measuring age, isn't it? Because I'm old enough to remember 10 and 15%, which before your time. And then just while we're sort of dashing around the sort of big budget sort of outlook points, on the question of growth, if I look ahead to the sort of medium and longer term, I'm looking at a picture of low growth, just over 1%, which is sort of trend pre-pandemic, I think, isn't that kind of area. I'm looking at. We'll come to this with the Resolution Foundation, and I think with Gavin as well. The household incomes really suppressed compared to where they were 10 years ago, and still relatively high taxes for this country. That's a pretty difficult cocktail, and it's not that far away, is it?
No, that's right. So the OBR's forecasting quite strong bounce back this year and next year, but then getting back to 1.3–1.5%-ish growth in the medium term once things settle down. As you say, that's kind of where we were expecting to be pre-pandemic, but it's quite noticeably slower than what we were used to before the financial crisis, when we were used to more like 2.5% a year growth. And it makes a huge difference to how we all feel about our living standards. It makes a huge difference to what the government is able to spend year after year. And it's really that I think was the difficult trade-off that Rishi Sunak was tackling in this budget, and that's really the kind of the problem that governments face, that to meet the demands of a kind of growing aging population, you either need to and if you've only got really slow growing economy and slow growing tax revenues, you've either got to find a way of doing more with less in the public sector, or you need to find a way of boosting that growth rate. And I'm not sure the measures announced in this budget were really a radical alteration of that growth outlook.
Yeah. And Gemma, I'm going to come on to Richard and Anne and others in a second, but just before I move on to them, that question I started with about whether this felt to you, with your Economist hat on, as a big budget or a small one, how do you think we'll look back on it?
I think it was quite a big budget in many ways, and if we take the budget and spending review together, perhaps as a package rather than just the budget on its own, because it was a sort of statement of this government's priorities. We saw quite an important sort of reaction from Rishi Sunak, which was that when handed good news on the public finances, what did he do with that? Unlike George Osborne, who would have used it to cut taxes, Rishi Sunak chose to use it to top up the spending plans and really do more to deliver on those government priority areas around levelling up and tackling some of the pandemic overhangs. So I think that it was quite a big moment for seeing what does this government do, what are its priorities beyond what's kind of dominated so far.
Yeah. Okay. Gemma, don't go away. We'll come back to you. But let me turn to Anne, because Anne, I think first of all, you have to go in about 20 minutes, so I do want to make sure we don't miss you. But I said at the beginning that I wondered whether we would look back and think this was a missed opportunity to address the scarring that has occurred for our children through the lack of education, just the disruption to their lives over the last year or two. The Chancellor was able to say that the scarring effect on the economy was less than he'd anticipated. But do you think the scarring effect on children was an under-recognised feature of this budget?
I have to say, I think it was. Look, there were a lot of things then there I was pleased to see. I had my checklist. I was particularly pleased to see the help in there about early years, around more help for families through family support and family hubs. I'm a children's centre Sure Start kind of person, but family hubs are pretty much the same with a bit of an extension. But so I'm pleased to see those, and can't take away from those, because there have been budgets where I haven't seen many of those at all. But there's a number of things really. I don't think it recognised the scale of scarring, as you say, for young people, both in terms of the education lost, biggest disruption since World War II, but also the scarring of mental health, and indeed in terms of poverty and families' own circumstance and the impact of that on kids. And I think that at this moment, it was a kind of stepping stone budget. It could go either way. It could be the start, pretty much, a steady start of a long-term commitment to really change things around. But on its own, it's not joined up. It doesn't join things up. It's not a clear narrative about a package. It doesn't signal that this is a start of a big push for young people in this kind of new era of optimism. Young people, I would hope, would be absolutely at the front of that queue. And it's not of the scale that's transformational. It might stop a few things getting worse, especially around local authority funding, although their costs are going to rise as well. But it's not of that transformational change that would really have signalled a big change, both in investing to save in the long term in terms of the cost of public services, but also in levelling up. And for those two alone, I think that it was a lost opportunity.
It is the problem that people like you face, who are concerned with children in particular, in your case, that we're now in a position where the NHS soaks up so much of the sort of national budget that actually, even a big budget like education is fighting for sort of, the scraps that are left over by the time the NHS has done what it needs to do. Yeah,
I mean, certainly the NHS budget, which is primarily spent on adults, let's remember as well, despite the fact that kids are kind of 20% of the population, it does soak up so much. And then you get the focus on schools. You know, this has gone back to 2010 funding and, you know, again, stopping some of that drain, but it is, you know, funding from, you know, significant time away now. But often it's seen as a kind of soft option, and it's not really seen as an economic necessity. And I've been speaking today at a conference around levelling up in the north. You know, this is absolutely the heart of what levelling up's about, the economics of it. If you don't have a workforce for the future, if you don't have skills in place, where can you possibly go in terms of levelling up? So I think, you know, the opportunity missed, which is so often missed, is that kids are seen as a kind of soft option, a bit of kind of youth club here, maybe a bit of kind of sports ground stuff here, but actually it seems needs to be not only an important kind of social issue, but really at its roots as well, an economic issue.
Okay, thanks for that for the time being. I'm just going to pick up on something that Emma Jackson is saying in the chat and come to you, Richard Bergen, if I may, because Emma's saying, just curious to know where this budget spending review leaves opposition fiscal policy, which was a point that I did want to raise with you, because you are now confronted by a relatively high tax and relatively high spending government, the highest average taxes since Clement Attlee, the highest public level of public spending since the 1970s. And I don't know if you saw the chart that we played before we started talking. There's a shape to this government spending that looks a lot more like Gordon Brown than it does like George Osborne. So politically, how do you, which I think is Emma's question, politically, how do you deal with this new conservative approach?
Well, it's true when you say about high tax levels overall, but I'm also concerned about the breakdown of that high taxation overall. And I do think, as you might expect me to say, that this budget and this government have really let the super rich off the hook. And what we've got is taxation disproportionately hitting hard at working people. You know, we've seen that with the national insurance increase. The government could, it was an option open to them, come forward with some form of wealth tax. There are many different options to that have been chosen. I've talked about, for example, an annual 1.5% wealth tax on those with wealth of over 100 million. The TUC's talked about bringing capital gains tax up to income tax levels. Both of those measures, you know, would raise far more money than the government raised through national insurance. So there are, you know, political choices there. But I agree with what has been said earlier, that austerity is over. But I think it's correct to say that austerity is over, but is not being reversed. And where we're looking at departments such as education, returning to 2010 spending levels, you know, things should be year on year getting better. We should be investing more in education. So returning to 2010 levels, you know, isn't sufficient in something like education, because obviously there's the scarring, as has been described, of young people in our communities over this pandemic, and that needs to be taken into account as well. In terms of opposition fiscal policy, I thought Rachel Reeves was very effective yesterday in really critiquing the government's record, not just over the last couple of years, but the 10 years of austerity that preceded it as well. But I think we now need to go further as an opposition and spell out a precise alternative. We're correct to say that they're reducing taxes on banks, but increasing taxes on workers. But I think as an opposition, we need to spell out our support for a wealth tax and spell out what kind of wealth tax we'd support, because there are a number of options. But something I would say is that, like many others, and I saw somebody put this in the chat, I was absolutely, and I'm not exaggerating, flabbergasted when I heard Rishi Sunak say that there was going to be that reduction on taxes in internal flights. I almost thought, does he mean external flight? No, internal flights. I thought that was absolutely extraordinary, even outside the context of us about to host COP26. And when we're looking at where growth can come from, and growth going forward, I would say, you know, we need to look at the a policy some people describe as the Green New Deal, which is getting more and more support. Investment in state-led investment in green jobs, which will help to rebuild areas like my own, because heavy manufacturing either disappeared or was exported. Then it was replaced by public sector jobs in the new Labour years. Then the banking crisis came, and with austerity, many of those public sector jobs have gone. So you've got plenty of places, including small towns, that feel they have no economic purpose as such. So not only can a Green New Deal help us to do our bit to tackle climate change, also inject into those areas. The point I'd make really is we need to tackle this rupture between growth and living standards. If you look in the United States, it's been 40 years of wages, and now it's less stark here in the UK. Already, we've had 12 years without wage increases, and that really is the economic reality which has led to many of the political tsunamis of recent years. I think Brexit is related to that. I think right-wing populism, its appeal is related to that. And so that's the nettle that any government has got to grasp. How do we deal with rupture between growth and living standards? The idea, they talk about the dream, but here, the people that came before us, our parents, there was always this understanding that whilst there may be tough times, your children would do better in inverted commas and have more opportunities than you do. And that progression has now been broken. That's reflected in some of the comments that have been made about young people feel.
Richard, and would the point of the wealth tax to be allow the Labour Party to say that we will also spend more than this Conservative government is proposing to spend?
Yes, I mean, we do need, more spending in relation to health and education. I mean, look, our society is ageing. So when we're comparing current spending with past spending, that's not the full picture, because society is not the same as it was before the banking crisis. We've got an aging population. Thank goodness that medical science is advancing, which enables us to preserve life and preserve the quality of life to a greater extent than in the past. But that comes at financial cost as well, and that needs to be funded. So there are actually greater challenges. And so, of course, we need to be spending more. I think the Labour leadership's right to say we should be spending wisely. When you look at the amount of money the government spent on some of its outsourcing projects, like test and trace with Serco, but there's no way we can go down the path of going with the narrative that somehow public spending is a bad thing or public spending is something we should be suspicious of, because especially when the government has ended austerity but hasn't reversed it, then those kind of narratives just won't work.
And Richard, from a purely political point of view, does cost of living feel like Labour's pressure point after this budget?
Oh, I think it's got to be. The cost of living crisis is real. As I say, 12 years of stagnated wages, no real hope at the moment of that changing anytime soon. We all know that bills have been going up. People have been thinking about prices, for example, but Labour has to be in touch with the people. And the thing that really is shaping people's stressful experience at the moment is the cost of living crisis and the wage crisis as well. That's people hard. And so, we need to provide solutions to that. And I do think that Rishi Sunak's narrative, as has been said earlier, is indeed very upbeat. Better times around the corner after the last 2 years of COVID. But if you look at it, the promising, growth now, but the growth slowing down in future years. But of course, we also need to ask ourselves the question about where does that growth go? Because there's no point in growth if its distribution isn't fairer and more equitable than it is now. We need to be looking to protect and lift the living standards of the majority of people. And what we have now, this is why the wealth tax has been talked about, by President Biden, it's been talked about around the world, is because we've got a situation where even where there's growth, more and more of that growth is being taken by the very top 1%, and disproportionately we see taxes hitting working people harder and not the super wealthy. And we can't have this situation. I mean, I was on the BBC Daily Politics a few weeks ago, whereas one of my fellow panelists on that said, what's the point? Why are you talking about a wealth tax? It is just impossible to get any money out of these people. And we can't have that kind of defeatism, and not if we're going to face the challenges ahead in terms of the aging population, in terms of climate change, in terms of trying to build a better, more equal and fair and more just society.
Yeah, okay. Richard, thank you for now. I'll definitely come back to you. But I just want to bring Peter Sigrist in from the chat, because Peter, you've been making a point about the government's priorities and the sort of the sort of appetite of health and you know, what it might mean for education. What's your read on the budget in light of the sort of, as you say, the amount of public spending that has been diverted to health in recent years?
Well, I think the trajectory of funding towards health has been there for a while. People were commenting today that 50% of departmental spending is now committed to health and social care. That's been the same for at least 5 or 6 years. It hasn't actually changed. It was lower back in 2010. And the problem, I think, is that people like me, I work in education quite a lot. And I've been looking for a number of years now to see more money going into education, because there are more children going to schools, and the lion's share of public funding in the school sector goes on the teachers. And so I've been looking for funding to rise to support that growth in the number of children. And eventually you have to realize, as year by year you look at it, healthcare is only going up. The answer is not going to be a lot more funding for education, but the goals don't change and our expectations don't change. And so I think the challenge for society and for the government at the moment is to think about what education outcomes look like, or how they can be achieved with through a different approach. And I think what will be very interesting is to see how this happens internationally, because the picture is almost identical globally. There will not be enough teachers to support even the Sustainable Development Goal of all children up to the age of 16 having a good quality education. It would take something like 30 or 40 million more teachers to be trained in the next decade, which I think is just not likely to happen. But what we might see is approaches developed in other countries and other parts of the world, which we reflect on and realize they are actually an alternative way of delivering a good quality education. Maybe using technology, maybe using different structures of education, maybe hybrid learning as part of it. I think there's lots to be thought about there, but eventually you have to accept the money is not going to go into education in the way that many of us wish it would.
Are you in a classroom now, Peter, or is that just a trendy office? I can't tell.
It's just a trendy office.
It's just a trendy, okay. I know, Andy, you've got to go in a second. So let me just come back to you on that point, whether I guess from what Peter's saying, you're ready to accept that you know, and as Richard was saying, the aging population is going to draw money into the health service, and that education just has to accept that it's going to do things differently, cheaper, if it's going to get there. Yeah.
No, I can't really accept that. It might be the reality, but I can't really accept that. Look, I think there's two things. There is a way that we can reduce the pressure on the public purse in the long term, which is about reducing the number of kids and young people and indeed families that are in crisis, because crisis costs a lot of money, whereas actually intervening early doesn't. That's a long-term investor save. But the other part of this is about you help grow the productivity of the nation through proper levelling up. So you actually invest in young people who at the moment have a very steep hill to climb, so that they can take part, you know, they can enjoy that prosperity too. And I think in those ways you build the wealth of the nation, rather than look at just how you share out the funds slightly differently, if you like. But, you know, we're looking at a situation where there are millions of kids who are in poverty at the moment. You know, those are kids who have talent. We need to make sure that they have opportunities in place, and we need to invest them as part of our future for all of us.
Great, and thank you for that. Let me just pick up, I want to bring Gavin and Mike in, because you sit interestingly in two think tanks that are on, you know, slightly different parts of the sort of centre right, centre left spectrums, from my perspective anyway. Gavin, let me come to you first, if I may. Would you, just to pick up on the point about children and what this budget did for education and children, and whether it sort of deals with the scarring that they definitely have experienced through the last couple of years, would you have liked to see more done for that cohort?
Yes, I think I would have liked to see more done to address the backlog and some of the social scarring that we've witnessed in the education sector. Of course, I appreciate that there were numerous vast spending expectations and pressures on the Chancellor, and of course he has to cut his coat according to his cloth somehow. But I mean, we at CSJ, for example, did a lot of work towards the end of 2020 on persistent severe school absence. So we now have over 93,000 school pupils who are actually absent more than their present. That's an increase of over 30,000 since 2019 pre-pandemic. And obviously on the impact of that on life chances is absolutely catastrophic. And of course, the earlier that happens in a pupil's career, the more severe those long-term longitudinal consequences are for the rest of their lives. So I think some of the social fallout of the pandemic is very much still unraveling, and the full extent of that is yet to be seen. It's good to see per pupil funding in general going back to austerity levels, but as you rightly pointed out earlier, that does mean no real terms per pupil growth for 10 years. But I think this question of the most disadvantaged and those who are going to suffer most as a consequence of not being in education or of falling off the school books for the preceding months, that is something that I think I'd have liked to see more of.
And I just want to check, I heard you right. Did you say that 93,000 children who are absent more than they're present in school?
That's right, yeah. That's the end of 2020 figure. And historically, what's that figure tended to be in the past? Approximately half to 2/3 of that. So we've seen between a half and 1/3 increase to that figure. That's a mixture of persistent and severe absence, which are slightly different categorizations, but they're obviously still huge problems.
Yeah, and that's a real store of trouble, isn't it, as you said? Okay, I want to come back with you, Gavin, and Mike as well, if I can bring you in to a point that Richard Bergen raised earlier on, which is this question of growth and living standards, which I think, one of the other reasons we may look back on this budget and think that the Chancellor didn't get everything right is maybe in a couple of years, the sort of sunny, optimistic tone that he struck is going to look slightly out of whack with the reality. Mike, I know at the Resolution Foundation, you've been doing publishing quite a lot of work, looking ahead to what's coming and looking at that squeeze on household incomes. Just describe what it is that you found, because it's incredibly stark.
Yeah, so the sunny uplands, the optimism is really only something that's going to apply for the next few months even. Looking just 1 year ahead, in yesterday's forecast from the OBR, it's clear that earnings are going to be falling in real terms. They're not keeping up with inflation. But more worrying was the longer run prognosis, where I think, as Gemma was saying, not only is growth due to be low over the next few years, but ultimately so will household income, with forecasts now being that household income will be growing by just 1.3% a year 5 years in the future. That's terrible. That's terrible. That feeds ultimately straight into living standards. And I think what's a little bit worrying about yesterday is that we don't really have a strategy for tackling this long-term or this post-financial crisis weakening in the growth in living standards. Lots of great graphs going around Twitter today where people extrapolating the pre-financial crisis growth in earnings and just showing the gap, the ever-growing gap between where we would have been had we stayed on that pre-financial crisis trend and where we are now. And that gap is it just seems to be getting bigger every decade. And we don't seem to have a strategy from the Chancellor to get us to that high wage, high productivity world that the Prime Minister speaks about so much.
Mike, I guess what's really worrying about the picture you paint there is that actually, as Chancellor, you could with the Bank of England, you could get inflation down, you could even potentially improve growth, but based on the last on the picture you paint, there's no reason now necessarily to believe that growth will feed through into household incomes in the way that it used to. And I just wonder how much of the problem you think is within the Chancellor's grasp and how much of it is structural and global and actually, you know, something we're going to have to think bigger and differently about.
Yeah, I don't think what's going on is a disconnect between growth and living standards, which is what we have seen in the US, and Richard was right to talk about that. We haven't yet seen that in the UK. The issue the UK faces is just weak productivity and weak economic growth. And so there's just nothing really, or not enough to go to households. I imagine where the debate might go is well, where the debate hopefully will go is, what do we do about that? And I can see the debate going in two ways. Perhaps given the Chancellor's nod to him wanting to be a low tax Conservative, we may see people saying, well, the reason we have anemic levels of growth is because we're taxing too much. And so the only way forward is to cut the tax burden, let innovators innovate, and that will generate growth. On the other hand, the alternative approach would be, well, the reason that we have weak levels of growth is because we have our investment levels are too low, whether that be in skills and human capital, or whether that be in physical capital. And so there, the way forward would be for the government to increase the tax cake and invest wisely, help us navigate our way through the next decade, particularly as we have to move towards our net zero commitments. So it may be that's where the debate's going. What's the best way to get growth back? Is it through an activist, high investing state, or is it through a low tax state, low tax economy?
Okay, thanks, Mike. I can see that Robert Campbell's got his digital hand up. Robert, can I come to you now? Are you wanting to come in? You'll probably have to unmute yourself if you're muted.
No, I've just done that. So one of the questions I've got, particularly on that last bit of the conversation, is how we're measuring growth. Is that really affecting that disconnect we have between growth and household incomes or income level things? Because it appears to me, I must admit to having read recently Mariana Mazzucato's view about how we measure GDP and whether there's much more in that which is non-productive, in the non-productive space, the rent issues that we're seeing in the City of London at the moment with people trying to penalise people working from home. Is the way in which we measure GDP and the way we measure growth affecting those calculations that we've just talked about?
Yeah. Richard, let me come back to you, Richard Bergen, because this conversation about whether we're measuring the right things has been rattling around for a while. In the same way that you're interested in wealth tax, which is another idea that's been knocking about for a bit, are you interested in different ways of measuring growth and measuring the economy?
Yeah, very much so. I know that New Zealand's considering having a well-being indices as a primary test for whether or not things are successful or not, rather than just growth. And I know that the idea of the donut has been talked about, hasn't it, whereby you have to give everyone a standard of living above a certain minimum, but ensure that the context in which we operate, i.e. the context of our planet that's very much under threat, isn't exceeded. So it's talked about as a kind of donut view of things. But I do think that this idea that the only measure of societal progress or economic success is growth, I do think that has to change. It has to be what kind of growth. That's why I'm particularly interested in the idea of a Green New Deal, because I do think that can drive growth, along with more methods of redistribution through a wealth tax, for example, and through boosting wages by working towards a £15 an hour minimum wage, for example. I do think that can be part of a progressive good growth, with the state really investing in these new green jobs that are required.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Emma Jackson, I've quoted you once, but I can see you're still very active there in the chat. Are you free to join the conversation? I just wanted you making a point about optimism and whether we should have a little straw poll on optimism on the call. But do you think that that optimistic tone is one of the things that the Chancellor might stub his toe on as a result of this budget?
Potentially, listening to the conversation in the room.
Because
yes.
if we did the poll that you wanted us to do, would you say you're feeling optimistic at the moment, or how are you feeling?
Well, possibly a bit pessimistic listening to this conversation, but
sorry, that's my fault.
that's being honest.
I'm in Wales, it's pouring down. I'm feeling a bit gloomy and tilted.
No, but I mean, but there has got to be an element of that, hasn't there? And I think, you know, fiscal policy does need to be aspirational but pragmatic. You need to give people something to be positive and aim for and feel bright about the future. And to be negative all the time is not necessarily going to help all those things that we need to achieve.
True. Then keep your fingers crossed that the positive thing turns up in time for the next election, probably. Thank you, Emma. Gavin, let me come back to you, because Mike helped us get going on the question of growth and living standards, which does seem to be a sort of critical thing for the long term. How big a problem do you think it is that those things, well, actually I think Mike was saying they haven't been completely decoupled. We haven't had enough growth, so we haven't had enough rise in living standards. Do you think there has been a decoupling in this country as we've seen in the States, or not to that extent?
I'm not sure if there's been a decoupling, but what I would say is that I think there have been serious problems and weaknesses in per capita growth. Often you find in journalistic reporting, the focus is entirely just on national GDP figures, but rather than looking on a per capita basis. Since the 2008 crisis. And if you actually take that to a more granular regional analysis and you look at some of the regions of the country, such as parts of the Northeast, you actually see that on a per capita basis, GDP was going down in real terms for several years after 2008, sometimes for up to 5 years at a time. And I think obviously there was that kind of big macro impact of the financial crisis. But I also think there are longer term structural problems to do with productivity that we mentioned. I was very interested to hear Richard Bergen mention deindustrialization and sort of the plight of economically left behind towns. I think one of the long term problems looking beyond the pandemic and COVID and those sorts of factors is the fact that manufacturing has declined as a proportion of our economy from 30% in the 70s to less than 10% now. It's very difficult to get total factor productivity increases that lead to higher wages in services sectors, but it is possible in manufacturing. So I would like to see a slightly more proactive industrial policy from the government to provide those sorts of incentives to invest in capital and in productivity boosting innovations that can actually lead to a situation where per capita growth starts going up in places where it's been dragging for a long time.
Gavin, it's not the same point, but it's perhaps related. There wasn't, or at least it seemed to me there was surprisingly little in this budget that directly addressed levelling up.
No, that's absolutely right. It's something that frustrates me greatly, which is that the term remains incredibly amorphous. To me, levelling up has to mean redressing this issue of the increasing geographical disparities within this country, which by any analysis, GDP per capita, gross value added, household income, whichever way measure you want to use, have been increasing rather than decreasing since at least the 1980s. This is a really long-term structural problem. What do you do about that? Well, I would like to see a much more proactive industrial policy, but I'd also like to see much more incentives for, in particular, manufacturers, but all industries to set up, invest and create jobs in different parts of the UK. And that involves creating an attractive regime, but it also might involve having a slightly more activist state than some conservatives would historically be comfortable with.
And that feels like a really significant problem, doesn't it? A number of people on this call and other things I've seen have made the point that this didn't feel like a coordinated budget. It didn't feel particularly well joined up. And if you haven't got a budget that deals with what we're told is the government's sort of signal priority, levelling up, then, you know, that's quite serious, isn't it?
I think it is serious. The focus of this seemed to be very much more on in some ways on kind of traditional conservative themes of work and doing the right thing. It was interesting to see Rishi Sunak talk about family, personal responsibility, and community. I think one positive that we were very pleased to see was the cutting of the universal credit taper rate from 63p in the pound down to 55p. That won't necessarily do much or anything to help those who are not in work at all on universal credit, but for those who are on in-work benefits, that will provide a significant boost to their incomes. And I think that is one way in which the Chancellor was trying to incentivize work and ensure that work pays. So I think on a kind of national level, that was encouraging. But I absolutely agree that on levelling up, I think, you know, there's far more for us that needs to be seen on this. I'll be very interested to see what emerges from the anticipated white paper, but there wasn't very much in there at all.
Yeah, interesting. I just want to come back to the politics of the whole thing for a minute. I'm going to bring my colleague Matt Dancona in, if I may. Matt, I know you're out there, but it seemed to me that, I mean, this was a kind of, there were moments when this was an explicitly political budget, the new rules that just felt like a piece of, the new economic rules that felt like a piece of political triangulation to box Labour in. There was that, but I think in the bigger sense of how profound a challenge to Labour a relatively high tax and spending Conservative government represents. That in the end, that's the bigger thing, isn't it?
It is, and as I agree. I think you put your finger on it, Ceri, at the start, really, when you said that this is a budget that we'll be talking about for years to come. And I bet we're not talking about the detail or the granular measures, but really about what it signified in, if you like, the navigation system of the Johnson government. And the answer today is we're not sure, really, because Phil Collins has done a good, he often does a piece analysing the rhetoric of speeches, and he's done a very good piece for us, which is live on the site now, which sort of, it makes the point that what Sunak was really doing was playing ventriloquist dummy to Boris Johnson. It was as if Boris had written the speech and Sunak was delivering it. You know, we know that Sunak is at heart not a spender at all. He's a low tax, low spend, austerity conservative, you know, formative years in the Thatcher era and so on. And he doesn't like any of this. I mean, he was prepared to go along with pandemic spending because it was a national emergency, but the kind of spending that Boris Johnson wants to do, which is on infrastructure and things like that, holds no appeal to him at all. I mean, on the sort of big spending, getting tanks on Labour's lawns, yes, I think that's true, but I also think that the spending sort of priorities, and this has already been points to be made by you and others, are slightly askew. I mean, there was very little about greenery, which was bizarre on the eve of COP, not enough on education, a sort of fairly lame attempt to reinvent Sure Start. They're really betting the farm on the NHS spending and to some extent on money getting into the social care system, query will it. So, even, you know, there's that. And on top of that, there's the problem that the Tory party really hasn't undergone a conversion to spending. And Boris Johnson is not like the rest of his party in this respect. The rest of his party likes winning, and it understands that Boris Johnson wins elections, but that doesn't mean that in their hearts, Tories have suddenly become Attleyites. It's just not the case. So this battle is not over. The other aspect to it all is the really hardcore retail politics dimension of this, which is, what does this actually amount to on the doorstep? You know, absolutely right to talk about the universal credit taper measures. That could put some money in pockets, but will that be wiped out by inflation? As you said at the top, is inflation going to lead to higher interest rates? And if it does, how high? And people's memory is quite short. I mean, you know, people talk about the 70s, but I'm not sure people remember even the 90s when people suddenly got into situations with negative equity. If Sunak's strategy doesn't lead to people feeling better off, he will be destroyed. I mean, it's a very interesting phenomenon, the Sunak phenomenon, because it's all looked so easy and shiny and straightforward, but actually he's one of the most vulnerable chancellors I can conceive of, because unless this gamble pays off, which is spending a bit more on some things, leading to enough people feeling better off, his own party, let alone the opposition, will tear him to pieces. So at the moment, Boris Johnson is more or less impregnable in his own party. Sunak has tried, I think, a little too hard to dislodge him and is now edging away from that strategy. And everything was the Prime Minister's economy, the Prime Minister's recovery yesterday. He's in quite a dangerous position. If this works, then his position as the heir apparent remains. If it doesn't work, he's finished.
Yeah, and Matt, having allowed himself to be ventriloquized by Boris Johnson, as you said, it's actually not going to be very easy, is it, for Rishi Sunak to regain the reputation that he wants? Because as you were hinting at there's this moment coming in a few years' time when spending is supposed to be transferred, the national insurance spending is supposed to be transferred away from the NHS towards social care.
Yeah.
People already thought that's unlikely to happen on the cusp of an election that will be, hot upon us then. So when is Rishi Sunak going to win back this reputation as a sort of George Osborne style austerity-minded chancellor?
Well, exactly. I think. I mean, I thought it was two speeches sort of jammed together, because there was a very curious passage in it where he talked like a disciple of Ayn Rand about how, government's never really present at the great moments in your life. Well, I think the people who run maternity units might have something to say about that. But it was pure sort of anti-government, right-wing libertarianism, stuck in the middle of a speech. It was all about, we spend more than Labour would. We're going to raise taxes. We're going to spend more on the NHS and all this sort of thing. I think he's probably already lost his reputation as, if you like, the defender of the old-fashioned fiscal hawk Tories. They won't go away. And if the politics it's very interesting, Dominic Cummings revealed, or claimed, one should say, I suppose properly, that Boris Johnson describes the Daily Telegraph as his real boss. And it was very interesting reading columnists in the Daily Telegraph today going ballistic at Johnson for this, Alistair Heath, who's the editor of the Sunday Telegraph but writes a column in the Daily, just said this was Brownism. It was a complete betrayal of everything that conservatism stands for. So I think for a lot of people who saw Sunak as the defender of fiscal conservatism, of prudence, of the Nigel Lawson spirit, they'll regard yesterday as a day from which he cannot come back, which means he is now, as you say, Ceri, lashed to Boris Johnson's fate. It has to work. The spending has to work, which is a very, very big if.
Yeah. Richard Bergen, let me just come back to you on the politics of this, because clearly a lot of this budget was aimed at constituencies like yours, or perhaps sort of constituencies outside big cities where people are more dependent on car driving than we are in London. The sort of Prosecco, fruit cider crowd. It's clearly targeting, what the Conservatives think are sort of red wall heartlands. And you can see from looking around you that Boris Johnson can work in those places. And that his optimism does seem fairly bulletproof, even if the economic picture is cloudy. So there are things for you as a Labour MP in the North to worry about, in spite of the clouds we can see on the horizon, aren't there?
I do think, though, that Matthew's correct when he talks about the fact that if Rishi Sunak's optimism, the rhetoric of optimism, doesn't become a reality in terms of people's living standards, then he'll be in deep trouble, particularly because some of his economic approach in this budget does offend the political and ideological sensibilities of many of the backbenchers. But you're right, Ceri. Really, what we're seeing is the Tories really trying to make permanent that Brexit kind of coalition in the so-called Red Wall seat. Some people thought that was a one-off, and that people who supported the Tories would only do so on that one occasion under the very particular circumstances of the Get Brexit Done election. But this shows that, unsurprisingly, I suppose, that the government aren't going to give up on those people. And it really is hard politics, the way that the so-called levelling up fund is being distributed. You see Rishi Sunak tweeting out at Labour MPs who've had levelling up applications accepted in their constituency, and Rishi Sunak is personally on Twitter with tailored graphics goading these Labour MPs in Doncaster and elsewhere to say thank you to the government, to congratulate him for delivering on this or that project in their constituency. So the Conservatives want to solidify that, and so you've got them pushing forward with the kind of higher spending that many voters in the so-called red wall seats, do want, who voted Labour in the past. But on cultural and social issues, the Conservatives obviously are taking a very different position to that of the Labour Party, and those are the kind of voters in particular that they're going for. And the challenge this gives to Labour, which of course is the bit that interests me particularly, is that it means that Labour's economic offer has to be practical, has to be transformative, and has to be specific about defending and lifting people's living standards in those communities. If you look at the kind of policies which were in our 2017 manifesto, they were popular at the time, those policies, amongst people who voted Tory and Labour. And some of those policies, whether it be on public ownership, on a wealth tax, on infrastructure, they're actually more popular now than they were then. And the Conservatives are alert to this. So I counsel the Labour leadership not to think that with this Conservative government in particular, they can get away with saying as little as possible and just hoping that the Tories electorally implode by the next election. I really don't think that's possible.
The truth is, isn't it, that there's no way the current leadership is going to go for a wealth tax like you propose, because it's just too risky in the current environment. It's untested. People, you can imagine the kind of campaigns that about inheritance that would be built around it, all, a manner of things. And it's not just, it's not just taxing the sort of international super rich. This is about people, that live around the corner. The Labour leadership is probably more likely to go for the sort of Brown Blair approach, isn't it, of accepting the spending envelope that's been laid down by the Conservative government and binding themselves to that for the first couple of years of a sort of putative Labour government. And that's probably what you're going to be arguing against, isn't it?
Well, I would argue against that if that's the approach that's taken. I mean, when it comes to a wealth tax, we're not talking about people who live next door or live around the corner. One of the policies I proposed was this tax on those with assets of over £100 million. That's a very small number of people with a very great amount of wealth. So I think in the messaging we could be clear on that. We oppose the increase in national insurance that hits working people. So the point to make is I think that we're on the side of working people, against unfair tax rises for them, but for fair wealth taxes on the super rich. I think the challenge for the Labour leadership is to move away from this narrative of the government are incompetent and come forward with practical, specific, bread and butter, popular policies now. We can't wait for the government to implode. Even if the economic situation gets worse, the Tories are very good at reinventing themselves. It may not be Boris Johnson that we face at the next election. So I think there's no room for complacency, from our leadership or for our party at all.
Okay, Richard, thank you. You've had, I hadn't kept my eye on the clock, but you turn out to have had the final word because we're actually over time. Thank you, everybody who's been here. Thank you to Gemma, who had to leave, and Anne, who had to leave, and to Mike, and to Gavin, and to you, Richard, and to everyone else who's contributed in the chat and on video as well. We set ourselves that question of what does this budget mean? And I think we didn't have a lot of argument with the idea that it will come to be seen as an important budget, an important sort of piece of political philosophy, or a shift in that, even if some of the measures, as Gavin was saying on sort of big ticket items like levelling up, weren't there. I think the point that Matthew Ancona was making just now, I think it's having got himself into this position, I think it is going to be difficult for Rishi Sunak to reverse out of it. So it feels as if even if he wants the shift to be temporary, it's more likely to be permanent. I'm interested in the consensus that there's been across different people from different parts of the political spectrum, that the measures taken to address the scarring effect on children's education feel like a miss. I think that the disconnect or the need to reconnect growth and living standards will be one of the big themes that we have to take forward out of this. And I think a whole bunch of other things have come up as well that I found fascinating that we'll want to follow up. I think the point you made, Gavin, about the number of children absent from school more than they're present is a figure I hadn't heard before, and is just one of those really startling things that hits you between the eyes. But in the end, I wonder if the thing that's really going to trip Rishi Sunak up is the optimism drug, and whether as people have been saying, it won't be long at all before that drug wears off. We've got this months rather than years. And the cold, hard reality of no wage growth, of spending rounds that have increased what we saw through austerity, but don't feel like real gains, and the sight of towns being regenerated more slowly than the government has led people to believe they might. They all feel like a basket of things that are going to crowd in quite tightly around this government, and all of them I think we're going to need to keep an eye on. But for now, let me thank everyone again, and we hope to see you. I can't remember, we're off to COP very soon, so I think we're going to see you probably next from there. But thank you for this evening. Enjoy your weekend, and we will see you soon. Bye for now.